Welcome to the Energy Show. I'm journalist Markham Hislop, and my guest today is Dan Walter from Ember Energy. So, welcome to the show, Dan.
Nice. Thanks for having me, Markham. Thanks for having me back.
We're going to be talking about a hot issue, but from a different angle today. Over the weekend, American jets bombed the three nuclear facilities in Iran, and the world's going nuts. I mean, Iran promised to retaliate against both the United States and Israel. Trump is not ruling out further military action. I mean, it's entirely possible that the U.S. could get sucked into a larger regional conflict. We have no idea how far or long this is going to go. But you and I today are going to discuss that issue from a point of view that no one else that I've seen in the media anywhere has tackled. And that is, could the disruption in the Middle East and in the oil industry generally that it causes turbocharge the energy transition, the transition to electrification? Because a lot of importers, I mean, 70% of the oil that goes through the Strait of Hormuz goes to Asia. And Asians might look at that, Asian countries like China and India and Japan, Korea, whatever, and go, you know what? We need less oil from there and we need more electricity that we can generate domestically. And maybe we buy or manufacture for ourselves wind turbines and solar panels and batteries and all of that stuff. So just give me your general take on that hypothesis.
I think that's quite right, and specifically in Asia. In the West, we've been struggling, I think, with governments that have been quite behind on electrification, right? So across the US, North America in general, and Europe, we actually saw that electrification stagnated around 2008 and it's been sort of around 20% of final energy consumption is electricity. But in Asia, we see across the board rapid electrification happening anyway. So these are governments that have this in the back of their mind anyway. And now there's just yet another incentive to go even faster on the fast trajectory that these countries are. The way I see it is that this is just, oil on the fire sounds a bit too on the nose, but oil on the fire of the electrification story in Asia.
Yeah, the disruptive innovation here, and this is a key part of our energy transition theory of change, is, the oil guys will say, look, for 125 years, we've been, it's king oil, right? And going forward, because we're going to have this big expansion in the global south in demand, it's going to be king oil for a long time. Like OPEC says, big growth out to 2050, never mind peak oil demand. But all of that is premised on the idea that oil fundamentally has never had a competitor. The internal combustion has ruled the world. And my dad was a mechanic. I grew up with my head under a car. It's not like I dislike the combustion engines, but you know what? Their time has peaked and is on the wane. And now it's electric vehicles, it's batteries, it's wind, it's solar, it's heat pumps, it's hydrogen, it's all of that kind of stuff. And I think that the West, where specifically the oil exporting states like Canada and the U.S. have drastically, seriously underestimated the disruption that competition has now caused for the oil industry.
I fully agree, Markham. This is what we discussed in the last episode as well, a little bit of like how the West approaches to a large extent the energy transition as a moral topic rather than as an opportunity. But I think what we're seeing now clearly again happening, and it of course also happened with the invasion of Ukraine, is as a de-risking strategy for your energy. So I agree. The main difference of today, and we already saw it again during the Ukraine crisis, is that there is a credible alternative. And it's also quite a focused alternative. So electrification and renewables, it sounds a bit sort of grand and oh, that must be quite tricky, but we're really talking about basically four technologies that can really help out here. We're talking about solar and wind on the supply side, and then we're talking about EVs and heat pumps on the demand side. Those technologies together is 70% of global import dependency you can reduce with just those four technologies. So you have a set of very simple, by now also very cheap technologies that there actually is overcapacity for in terms of manufacturing in the world. So factories are at the ready to produce these things. And those four can reduce global energy independence by 70%. Now, of course, today in the Iran story, one of the main levers, the most interesting levers, is the EV, as that targets specifically, of course, oil demand for combustion engines. And that is some $600 billion per year in net imports that you can avoid through deploying EVs. That is a tremendous amount of money. And I have to say there that 600 billion before we're going to inevitably see oil prices go up. Very likely by the end of the week or next week, if we see barrel prices go above 100, where it's going to be more like $1 trillion opportunity to actually get EVs in and avoid that additional oil cost. So there's an enormous opportunity of just a few technologies that can change the game.
There's an interesting trend that showed up in the IEA's, the International Energy Agency's Global Energy Investment Report. Came out a month or so ago, and I've been meaning to get to it, but there's just been so many energy stories that it keeps getting pushed back on my priority list. But the key headline here is that out of the I think it's $3.3 trillion that'll be invested in 2025, two-thirds of it, two-thirds is going to electrification, and only one-third will go into fossil fuels. And I think the amount that's actually going to be invested in oil and gas is even, is quite a bit lower, 600 billion, something like that. And that's down a lot from, say 5, 6 years ago when it was up over $1 trillion. So where I'm going with this, Dan, is that the money talks. And money has decided, smart money has decided that the future is going to be electric. They're pouring capital into these various projects. And I suspect that there's more capital to be had if the pace of electrification picks up because of the Middle Eastern conflict.
I subscribe to that entirely. And also more money to be made, by the way, on the electrification side. So, of
Yeah.
course, there's been a boom of wind and solar manufacturing, like the actual panels and then the cells and this kind of stuff. But of course, the deployment and operations. But this is all utility business. This is low margin business. Of course, what's very interesting is on the demand side of things, you're closer to the consumer. So you actually are working with higher profit margins. So again, also in terms of not just in terms of where capital can be deployed, but in terms of where money can be made, there's a tremendous opportunity in electrification. And so at the moment, what we're seeing is that Trump's decision to dive into this Iran war is really yet another blessing for China and their built up overcapacity of solar panels and battery manufacturing, because this puts even higher pressure on the rest of the world to offtake their products. They're the only ones that have large amounts of excess capacity of battery manufacturing and solar panels, and the rest of the world will want it even more than now. So the drill baby drill president is so far actually really pushing the Chinese narrative into the rest of the world of don't trust oil states. Even the most trustworthy one, the US, you can no longer really trust. Rather, pick a technology like solar panels and EVs to be self-reliant rather than reliant on your neighbors or people far away abroad.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, buy it once and produce for a long time. It's funny you should mention, China. Trump actually helping out China here because I did a video a news story on the weekend on that very topic and arguing that what Trump is doing is ultimately going to benefit China. But he's not the only one. I mean, Biden last year when he put the 100% EV tariff on Chinese EVs did the same kind of thing because, and I said at the time, I said, you watch, China was going to pivot into the global south where they already have made inroads. I mean, it's not like China wasn't there before. They're simply going to accelerate what they're already doing. And what do we see? Big increase in exports, big increase in announcements of investment in plants in Brazil, Hungary, Turkey, all over the place, and more investment in infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative. And, China is, and this may be the biggest difference between the global north and the global south, or at least North America. China is strategic. It started on this path 20 years ago. It had industrial policy, it had an industrial strategy, and then industrial policies that operated at both the national level, the provincial level, and even at the local, the city level, municipal level. They have been incredibly strategic, and The global north is not. I mean, Europe was more, give them credit for that. But North America, like the United States and Canada, have been, I mean, asleep at the switch, to be honest.
And I see there, I think with that, we also see a little bit what happens when you over liberalize sectors that your whole economy depends on, like energy. If you liberalize everywhere, you create a culture of quarter by quarter incentives to get payback to your investors. Well, guess what you don't do? You don't think, decade by decade anymore. And that's exactly what you need to do in energy because investments are always coming to fruition over decadal periods, not over year to year periods. And I think that that's been the strength of China to some extent. I mean, we also shouldn't be there shouldn't be too much magical thinking about it. China, in that extent, also copied what the West used to do in their energy strategy before the 90s. Long strategic thinking about the base fundamental needs that humans need and that Westerners need to be successful and plan for that. And somewhere, I think, along the way over the last 15, 20 years, we kind of lost that in the West, as evidenced, as I mentioned at the top of this conversation, as well with the stagnation of electrification in the West. Very staggering numbers around 2008. You just see like a kink in the line, and all of a sudden, the West stops electrifying whilst the rest of the world continues on. There's a bit of short-term thinking here that again we're at risk of right now with the Iran crisis. I mean, the silly way to respond to this is just say, okay, let's do even more diversification of sources for oil and other fossils coming into my country. The right response to what is happening right now is seeing this as a sector that's too unreliable to basically build the foundations of everything else in your society on, because that's, of course, what energy is.
I have a comment here that's aimed primarily at my Canadian audience, in particular the Alberta audience, because I get a lot of pushback from folks in Alberta saying, look, what you're arguing is the exact opposite of what the oil and gas industry is arguing. And are you telling me that all of those highly paid CEOs that make tens of millions of dollars, and all of the smart, the eggheads they've got in their planning departments, the economists and so on, they've all missed the boat? But you all by yourself, Markham, you caught it and they missed it? How is that possible? Well, I'll tell you what, they have not read the drunken emails I get from the oil and gas industry, the chairmen of the board of very large oil companies, political staffers who have been involved in the energy file. And if you think for a moment that all the best and the brightest are running the oil industry, I got news for you. They are as they're entrenched in a narrative that is no longer relevant, in my view, in this day and age. And a lot of it is driven by short-term thinking, quarterly thinking. How do I keep up my stock price up? And
I think also, Mark, to quote you back, follow the money here. Look where the money goes. Look where oil and gas companies are actually putting their money over the past 5, 6 years. I mean, when we go back a decade ago, most of the capital layouts of an oil and gas company would be indeed in drilling for more oil or building up more infrastructure. I think in the latest IEA investment report, I have to check the number. I think it was about a third last year, but now it's, I believe more than 50% of the outlays are share buybacks. These are ways to prop up your share price. These are things that have very little to do with investing in the future of your business. They have to do with keeping up appearances. And so there's a follow the money component to it. It's like, yes, there's some very convincing scenarios out there about oil and gas companies that claim we've done this for 120 years, so we can do it for another 120 years. Trust us, we got this. But when you actually look at, and then they say like the Exxons of this world, oil and gas demand is just up and up and up from here. But if you actually look at where they're putting their capital, that's not at all in their scenarios. So we always like to joke, we produce our S-curve scenarios, is that the Exxons and the Shells of this world, they promote their own business as usual scenarios, but they invest in our S-curve scenarios because they too see this coming. They just want to keep up appearances for as long as possible and make money whilst it lasts.
I had a couple of thoughts on that. And one of them is that there was a Reuters story that I've got tucked away in my computer someplace so I can get to it. It came out 3 or 4 months ago. And it was all about what the super majors are investing in for the future. And so the ExxonMobil and the Shells and so on. And their point was that they're divesting themselves of higher break-even cost fields and high emission intensity fields, and they're flooding into places like Ghana where the break-even costs are like $30 a barrel, or maybe even lower, and their emissions intensity is very low because these guys are anticipating that China is going to have its carbon market apply to the refining and petrochemical industry 2027 to 2030. The Europe's carbon border adjustment mechanism, it doesn't have oil in it right now, but the odds are that at some point in the future it will. So they know there's going to be you're going to if you got to like the Alberta oil sands, you're going to have to pay a premium because of your carbon intensity.
Yeah.
So that goes right to what you said, which is follow the money. Where are they going? They're planning, and the point of the article was the super majors are planning for decline. That's the key. So I don't care what the Alberta oil companies are doing. I do care what ExxonMobil's doing.
Exactly. And that's all it needs. You only need a couple of companies to start planning, to start overbuilding capacity, whilst the actual industry is going in decline because of these scenarios that are out there, because of people are overextending, and you get huge, huge gluts. Like, let's not forget for how cheap the Saudis can actually produce oil, right? So we're talking about 60, $70 per barrel, maybe going to over 100. They can produce for a few dozen dollars per barrel. They can produce. This is, to some extent, the fair price of oil. There's so much rent and so much fat into this system, which is built up through an OPEC, through a cartel. Once that bubble pops, once you see OPEC breaking up, then you actually are going to see very quickly how cheap oil can actually get, and therefore also how unprofitable many of these companies are. So for instance, to the argument of the profitability of oil and gas versus the lack of profitability of wind and solar, as for instance in the Price is Wrong, that book makes that argument. That is only because oil and gas has a cartel position on and cornered the market on oil and gas. That's why they can be so profitable. And I think this Iran crisis will likely spike the prices up, but it may well also pop the bubble of OPEC. And once that comes apart, it's going to really hurt. And I would have to say, unfortunately, also for regions like Alberta, they are top of the cost curve. It will hurt there the most first. When oil prices or oil demand goes down by a few percent, that immediately hits the top of the cost curve, and that really hurts.
Dan, I've got to jump in on this one because there's a common misunderstanding that Alberta is at the top of the cost curve when it's not. And here's why it's not. The oil sands are unique in the fact they're more like a manufacturing operation than an oil production. That they mine or they use steam assisted gravity drainage, and most of your capital is spent upfront to build the infrastructure, to build the plants, to build all, bring in electric power and all of that kind of stuff, big boilers, what have you. The cost to operate those are quite low. And so what we're seeing is break evens in West Texas intermediate dollars of around between $30 and $40, maybe some in the low 40s. And if we're talking about a half cycle cost, where all they have to do is keep production going, keep the lights on, it can be down into the 20s. So the oil sands companies keep saying this, and it kind of gets discounted. But I've seen the numbers. I've crunched the numbers, and they're right. And the oil sands are a lot more profitable. But then that's also because they don't have to pay the cost of reclaiming their environmental liabilities, which now are up around 260, 200, $300 billion. They haven't spent hardly any money bringing down their emissions intensity. So they've kind of been let off the hook in that sense. But if that continues, they could ride out a price war, at least for a limited amount of time.
So they can ride out a price war, and their short run marginal costs sort of can make leave them in the market, but you don't get your money back if you put all that capex in up front. So you do need eventually over the lifetime of your asset, you need to have a high oil price to actually get all that upfront investment in, let alone the other costs that you mentioned. But I mean, I take it as read. I mean, perhaps Alberta has a little bit longer than the immediate damage that we see to other regions on oil and gas. But I still feel, I still believe that there's a real challenge across the industry. And you know what it is? I think there's a lack of understanding of how volatile prices can really disrupt the business for the large oil majors, and how even what's happening right now with oil prices shooting up, and we're seeing now across the world some muted cheers going up by the oil and gas companies that oil prices are rising again and profitability is going up. That's also not good for business cases. This just means more volatility. It makes it more scary for investors to invest in this sector. And if I'm putting a hell of a lot of capex upfront for something, I want stability in the long term. I don't want oil prices to shoot up and down, even if it is from 100 to 50, and I'm still profitable at 20. I still don't like it because it is just chaos. And there's one thing, especially institutional investors don't like, it's chaos.
You know what? Consumers don't like it either. And what we've
Sure.
seen is, and here's an example, Pakistan last year, they bought $1.4 billion worth of cheap Chinese solar panels. And this was distributed. So it was going on rooftops and balconies and so on. And the demand on the Pakistan power grid went down 9%.
Yeah.
During a time of electrification, it went down. And consumers were doing that, and not only consumers, industry and big businesses. Because if you've got an industry and you're worried that you might have a risk to your fuel supply, whether it's electricity or maybe you use gas as a feedstock or oil as whatever it is, then you begin looking around for ways to lower your risk. And self-generation and storage on site is increasingly a way to do that,
Yes.
and also it relieves some pressure on the grid. So there are lots of pressures here that where now consumers and businesses can respond to risk, higher degrees of risk in a way they couldn't even 5 years ago.
Yes, and this what makes this moment so interesting with the overcapacity of solar panels, solar panel manufacturing and battery manufacturing, EV manufacturing in China, because China stands at the ready to make the alternative technology for the world, and they've invested in this, and many people call them to some extent crazy for over investing to such an extent in solar and in EVs, etc. But now in a crisis like this, it's coming in very handy, of course, for our own domestic market, because that still remains the largest market for China as their own domestic market, and getting rid of their own. I mean, it's 20% of their primary energy comes from imports, which is compared to the rest of the world not that high, but for China enough to go all out to push electrification into their own market. But now, especially also now that Europe and North America as well as with tariffs up, they can supply this for cheap to the rest of the world. And so the rest of the world right now sees again an example of how being dependent on imports, now it's oil, but it can also be LNG, how that is scary and exposing you to risks you don't fully understand. And they get basically pitched by the Chinese on a completely different story, which is we come by, we install solar panels, we put a battery on top. We just released this new report in Ember where we show that you can get close to 24 hours, 365 days a year base load capacity out of solar plus batteries. And then we kind of can leave you and you're fully independent to run your energy system for 30 years. Yeah, that becomes a very simple deal to make, especially if you're in a country like most of the world is, like 75% of the world is, in a country that doesn't have enough fossil fuels to ever power yourself, let alone become an energy user like America. Just become an energy user like Bulgaria or like southern Italy. Already for that, there's not enough energy in any of these countries to achieve that on the fossil fuel side. So it has to come from something else. And solar plus batteries is just a much better deal.
Yes, but they do have a lot of sunlight.
And a lot of an even better deal. Exactly.
Yeah, it's I'm shocked the extent to which the oil and gas companies are unaware of the kinds of things we're talking about. And I make this point all the time in Canada. When you have the conversation in Canada around energy, it always revolves around pipelines and oil and LNG. And we're talking about electricity, now we're talking about, oh my God, wind and solar are intermittent. We need to have gas backup. The oil industry has done a remarkable job of capturing the national discourse around energy in Canada. And I make the point, When you step outside of Canada, and you're from the Netherlands and you're living in New York, and I talked to you and I talked to Kingsmill Bond and your team and folks from Asia and Europe, completely different view, just a completely different view of perception of energy and the energy future. That would be shocking to Canadians if they heard that.
Yeah, yeah, and it's the category error, I think, thinking that um, energy is energy is energy. So oil and gas is an energy company. They are energy companies because they're in the energy space. So are solar companies. So surely oil and gas is something very clever to say about solar, which completely, I think, misses the point of what is really happening, which is that it's tech in the digital space coming into energy. Like there's more in common between a solar panel and a laptop than between a solar panel and a barrel of oil, right? And so, to some extent, if we want to know the future of energy, I think it's better to listen to the tech companies of this world. For instance, you can listen to Tim Cook, who says, we cannot do without Chinese manufacturing. They have the skills. They know where the future is heading. When we want to know the future of Apple, we go to China to talk to their R&D departments that are housed in Shenzhen. They have much better sense of where the future also of energy is going, I think, than the oil companies do, because they are, I mean, settled in their ways and haven't been disrupted for decades.
So, we started this conversation by talking about the conflict in Iran and the impact that that might have on oil supply and prices, and then would that be a disruption in the energy transition? Then we got off talking a lot about the energy transition, and I want to bring it back to Iran and the military conflict because the what's different between now and 2022, 3 years ago is the technology is so much better. It's so much cheaper. It's so much more plentiful than it was, and people's attitudes have changed. I think that's a big one. People now are thinking about electrification. And I'm most, of course, plugged into the Canadian and to some extent the US. But I think my take on this is that the really key consumers, which are the ones in the global South and Africa, Latin America, and Asia, their perception of energy has changed. And they're much more open to electrification. I mean, Bloomberg NEF says that 43% of China's two and three wheelers are now electric. And the big percentage, I forget what it is, 28 or 30% of their buses are now electric. I mean, electric is just everywhere and is perceived as the future. It's the coming thing. We're not there yet, 100%, yeah, but we're well on our way, and that is where the future is going. And that leaves a tremendous opportunity when uncertainty and risk increases, like it will with this military conflict. You've got a group of consumers who are going, okay, I'm ready. You convinced me that I will now get a solar panel and an electric vehicle and a battery in my garage. And I don't think that was the case 3 years ago or 5 years ago.
And to some extent, what we saw in Europe happening after the invasion of Ukraine was a dry run for future energy crises. And back then, I mean, I believe I was on your show then as well. We said like this is just one of many fossil crises that are coming and price spikes that are coming. And of course, I mean, of course we were right. Of course, this was bound to happen, and we see now yet another one. And from the Ukraine crisis in Europe, we've learned also how quickly people can change their attitudes and behaviors. How quickly, I mean, you saw this huge spike in heat pump sales coming into Europe. It's to some extent why we saw the heat pump sales going down over the last couple of years, is because there was so much front loading of people wanting to do something and investing in a heat pump, lowering their gas demand, implementing more rigorous efficiency measures across industry to actually lower gas demand. And I think this is yet another, or at least currently on track to be yet another one of those crises where we can see a lot like a watershed moment where people, they alter their behavior by 2 or 3%, not a lot, and all of a sudden EV totally fits in their life. And there's a much bigger economic and security incentive to do so right now. And so I agree with you. This may well now turn into a Ukraine situation, but probably more focused towards Asia than Europe at the moment, because that's where most of the oil that goes through the Hormuz Strait now goes into. So this might be to some extent an Asian Ukraine moment.
I want to make another point about the system that sort of is the foundation of electrification. And we're talking mostly about the power grid here, but also generation. And a lot of the technologies that are required to integrate intermittent power generation like wind and solar into the grid weren't really available in 2022, and they certainly weren't available in 2020. So we're talking about grid forming inverters, and we're talking about digitalization and all of these fancy things that, grid engineers would be more familiar with now. Uh, but now what we're seeing, and I've had some guests on here like Gerhard Schlager from Hitachi Energy, who are saying we now have the technology and the engineering skills that we can bring this technology into your grid. So as your intermittent generation, the percentage rises, we can put in place storage. We can put in place, these other things that are required so that you can actually have a lower cost, more resilient, and more reliable grid than you had before under the old system. But it's happening so quickly that people's perception of what is available and the reality of what is available aren't always in sync. But I think this, and a reason I bring this up, Dan, is because the oil boosters will say the electricity systems deficiencies are an impediment to adoption and will always be an impediment to adoption, as if we're not ever going to, put enough storage in or something. And I think that's a fundamental fallacy in the West, in the global North, because the very thing they say is an impediment is in fact changing and will be an enabler in the very near future.
It's the classic disruption fallacy as well. Is that if you can't do exactly what I can do, there's no way you can disrupt me. I mean, that's exactly what Blockbuster said about streaming, or what Nokia said about smartphones. This is exactly the kind of attitude where, like, actually, the points that are seen commonly as the weakness of solar and batteries are actually its strengths when used in the right way. And I think the story in the global south here is quite interesting, because we have here markets where power, like reliability of the grid, is in any case not very high. Power outages are very normal. It is already really quite something to get electricity in, even if it is only the daytime and with a small battery the evening time. That already is a huge upgrade of quality of life. That you have a huge market to sell into. So the argument to make that what you see now often by the LNG guys and by the other fossil exporters, that people in Africa want exactly 99%, 99.99% reliability for all day, every day, because that's what fossils can deliver, is of course completely laughable if you're from the global south, because you go like, I know there's a coal plant right there and it has about an availability of maybe 80% and it's off all the time and I can't rely on it. At least with the solar panel, I know that when the sun is up, it's working, and when it's in my battery, it's mine and no one can cut me off. And so I think there's a misunderstanding, a classic disruption misunderstanding of how powerful these technologies can be exactly when they are deployed into low margin, lower profit markets, exactly used for in those kind of applications where the conventional industry says, oh, we don't even bother selling into those communities.
I'm glad you brought up Blockbuster because there's a very important part of that story that often gets glossed over, and that is Netflix went to Blockbuster in, I think it was 2006, and said, "We'd like you to buy us for $50 million." So Blockbuster considered it, and they did their due diligence, they tore apart the business plan, and so on. And what they did is they concluded that there will never be enough broadband service to support streaming in households.
Yeah.
And that was a fundamental mistake on their part because 4 years later they were bankrupt and Netflix has gone on, to become this huge international company. So, and Clay
Yeah.
Christensen, the professor from Harvard Business School, who is the guru of disruption, he said there is no business too big to be disrupted and fail.
Yeah.
And often, the fact that they're that big and they're not nimble enough to make changes and adapt their business model to disruption means they will fail. And
Yes.
so you might, last year I had a presentation to the oil sands company in Alberta, and I said, "You're disrupted. You haven't, you're not really feeling it, but you are." And I said, "My guess is that by the early 2030s, we'll see some of your companies already starting to fail." and some of them will be bankrupt by 2035. Oh, was I not popular? But you know what? You can follow the disruption up the curve, and first of all, you disrupt the auto industry. Electrification, China takes over, drives down prices. So you big time disrupt the auto industry. Well, where does the fuel come from? It comes from oil. So it's next on the chain to be disrupted in that big way. And given the pace at which things are going, it only makes sense that in 5 years, this is going to be, we'll see massive changes. Things just move too quickly these days.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, yeah, it's classic underestimating the pace of change and disruption, and also as an investor, therefore, like one of the great risks I think I see in the current system is incumbents are uninvestable even when they accept that disruption is happening, but they have some sort of a plan, typically kind of fails. When it becomes even more risky is when you have a set of incumbents that claim that nothing is going on, that claim that growth is here to stay. And I think I fear to some extent that this Iran crisis, if oil and gas prices are going to spike again over this summer, is going to again lead to very good dividend payouts, a lot of share buybacks, and everyone's saying again, oh, see, oil and gas companies are making good profit. And strengthens their thesis in the Western debate that oil and gas is profitable and here to stay, whilst in fact this is just a big supply shortage that is hitting the market while they're making a lot of profit. And that's very dangerous from an investor point of view because you have a company that is just not ready for the inevitable plunge that is coming. And that makes it incredibly high risk to invest in. And so, in a moment like this, the gut reaction, the very simple reaction might be let's invest in oil and gas and diversify and get more diverse sources of oil out of the ground so we can get it into the world. Whilst I think the real long term investor should look at this and go, this is writing on the wall. It is time to diversify to the alternative because that brings stability where oil and gas brings chaos. And that's quite new, I would say. I think this bringing of chaos, that's new because oil and gas has been an industry that was thriving on stability and growth for 120 years now. That it was one of the reasons they want to bring stabilities into countries to actually make sure they could sell oil and gas into those markets. Those incentives, now that they're at the peak, at the plateau, those incentives are, of course, turning. The chaos of Putin's invasion in Ukraine led to more profits. The chaos now in Iran is leading to more profits. And so the incentive for oil and gas companies to keep the peace and keep stability is, of course, turning. And that might lead to some quite chaotic years ahead because as these incentives change, so might actually be the strategy of engaging with these with foreign nations.
Let's wrap up the interview this way, Dan. I want to make the point. I want to follow up on your point where oil companies can look at this, a couple of different ways. One is, they see change coming, can't do anything about it, can't adapt quickly enough, or they deny change is coming. And that is the position in which Canada finds itself in because the oil industry has put so much effort over the last 10, 15 years into dominating the narrative, the public and political narrative around energy, that they have bought into 100% into the OPEC modeling that shows oil demand is going to increase from 103 million barrels a day to 120 by the middle of the century. And so their cry is, why can't we get some of that? If we doubled our oil production from 4 million barrels a day to 8 million barrels a day, it's only 25% of growth. Why can't we do that? Why are you holding us back from doing that? And the perniciousness of the OPEC modeling is that it provides a very convincing narrative. And more, I'm beginning to realize that decisions about where people invest and what policies are put in place and decisions, to expand are not driven by data. They're driven by narrative. And so OPEC has provided a well-modeled wrong, because I've read it and I don't agree with it, but they can use it. Well, OPEC's Secretary General was in Alberta just a week or 10 days ago saying, Haitham Al-Ghan, he said, there is no oil peak in demand coming. Folks, it is not happening. We're going to have growth out to, And then that got reported by, all of the papers in town, and it was all over Canada. Uh, that's the kind of narrative, it's the blockbuster narrative.
Yeah. And the narrative of we can maintain control over the energy market as a whole. We can exert our power to maintain control over the markets that we sell into. And it's in that sense denying reality of the fact that 90% of capacity additions in the world in the power sector are for wind and solar. It's denying the fact that now half of car sales in China are EV and the world will soon follow. So I think it's denying facts, and it's therefore very dangerous. And I think if there was a real estate crisis in 2008 that hurt the global economy, if we continue also to invest as we do in oil and gas, and keep giving licenses to operate to oil and gas companies on the basis of it's only up and up and up from here, we're exposing ourselves to an incredible downfall. And so for the United States on actual oil and gas, as in Europe, for instance, Germany on oil and gas enabling technologies with internal combustion engines, these are large export markets. I think in the US, it's like number 1 through to 5 largest exports are all petroleum based. In Germany, it's the car industry, largely petroleum based. Now, luckily, switching to EV slowly. But there's a huge exposure. And then when this bubble pops, because it is a bubble. I mean, that's what you're describing. You build a narrative and that blows up this bubble. When it pops, that's going to really hurt. And I hope also for both of our sakes that our retirement funds are not overly extended here. I hope for both of our sakes that the companies that made our countries great are not overly extended and are prepared for disruption. Because at the moment, it is happening in fact, but it's not happening in the public discourse, and that's quite dangerous.
Uh, Final thought. The oil companies in Canada are not planning for disruption. They denied disruption. So there's all kinds of public comments and so on you can use to back up that argument. What really worries me is that we have Mark Carney, a guy with a PhD in economics from Oxford, who's run two central banks, over the last decade been the world's has had the highest profile in climate finance. And either he doesn't get some of this, because he gets a lot of it. I give him credit for that. But if he doesn't get some of the key parts, or he feels that he has to mute that for political reasons, like he doesn't want to go too far too fast, whatever. But Mark Carney may, in fact, wind up perpetuating the status quo in Canada rather than enabling the transition, which then would set Canada up for future prosperity after 2030. So that's a story to watch. We're certainly watching it here. Is what does Carney do? What are his energy policies? What are his economic policies? But Dan, thank you very much for this, man. It's a pleasure as always for us to converse about this.
Thank you for having me, Markham.